How will you and your work be remembered? Good morning. My name is Angelina Carlton. I'm the hostess of the Design Your Legacy podcast. And this lovely Friday morning, I get the privilege to introduce you to John Williams. He is an internationally recognized architect with over 40 years experience in both commercial and residential projects. He's been a builder, a developer, and an architectural designer. His work has been featured in Architectural Digest, Canadian Architecture and Design, House and Home, Trends, West of the City, and Forum magazines, just to name a few. It is with great pride and integrity that he credits his clients with thanks for the opportunities to showcase his designs. His education is both from Canada as well as the United States, but today his domicile is in Toronto, Canada. Welcome, Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Angelina. Nice to see you, and hope all the weather's good out on the West Coast.
It is lovely today. So would you just break the ice a little further and share about your background more? What inspired you to become an architect? What's the backstory?
Well, that's interesting. The inspiration, of course, I think if I'm remembering now, for me, this is a long way back. We're talking the 50s. But I remember having, I think it was my 8th grade teacher or 7th grade teacher, who was the art teacher as well. Lovely older woman. And every time I drew something, whether I was listening to her or not, I tended to sketch continually. And she eventually looked at me and said, "You realize you're going to be an architect?" I said, "Well, what?" I didn't even know what an architect was at the time. So it was quite sort of funny. And eventually, after I finished my service in the United States, I decided, well, time to go to college and university. So maybe I'll be a doctor. I'd like to be a brain surgeon. How wonderful would that be? Well, of course, I wasn't able to put together enough money for the years that were going to be required to become a internationally recognized surgeon. So I had a friend that said, what's your second sort of favorite place to go? And I said, well, how about architecture? That might be something I might enjoy doing. And of course, I got into it, started studying architectural technology, and then moved from there to regular architectural school. And then after graduating from there on to do my master's. And little did I know it was going to take just as many years and be just as expensive as being a doctor. So when you're finished, all of those years, probably 8 to 10 years of university and colleges by the time you're finished. So it was a long haul. But today, here I am, and I'm 50 years through practice, and started looking the fall of my sort of practice, which is interesting when I say fall, autumn of my practice. Yeah.
Yes, and architecture is amazing. So I'm a huge fan of well-designed buildings as well as homes. And I also consider it art inspired by real life and client dreams. Would you tell me about how the influence of light as well as nature has impacted your imagination, how you approach a project?
Well, light is huge. Anybody who lives in Canada understands what winter is all about and how much the light is needed in a home so that you don't get depressed. I mean, these are sort of basic human needs. And it's the same all over the world. If you're developing something or building a house in Italy, the key is to control that light because it becomes so strong with sunshine, and shade is more important perhaps. But again, it's how you deal with light.
Yeah, I just wanted to interrupt for 1 second to share that I remember while I was at Penn State, we would wave goodbye to the sun, and we had to make an effort to stay happy and joyous. Anyways, keep going, please.
Absolutely. And most people are affected. They may not realize it, but they are tremendously affected by the amount of light in their house. Whether, if there isn't enough light, their depression factors can be much, much higher, or their joy factors. And when we start off a project, the first things we look at when we visit the site, we do an analysis of that site and to determine where the sun is going to rise, where it's going to set, where it's going to be during the certain times of the day, and through the 4 seasons as well. And those are important factors that go all go into the design of the house. And most people don't really appreciate that because most of us live in, there's probably only 3% of the residential world that gets to live in a custom designed house. The rest of us probably end up living in a tract house built by a builder that doesn't have any of those considerations taken into the design. So it's an interesting thing that when you get to do a custom home, that's one of the first elements that comes into play. And of course, from a landscape point of view, or the vegetation of the site and the views, that's probably the second thing that affects people more than anything. I think you've probably heard the old adage by the real estate people, if you can't really afford to renovate the house, do the landscaping, you'll get your money out of the landscaping, right? And that's why people love the plants, the greenery, because we're humans and we relate to the natural world. Whether we have been away from it for 3,000 or 4,000 years, it doesn't matter. It's still in our blood. So these are important elements.
Absolutely. And I think humanity also relates and responds differently to beauty. So if
Oh,
they're in a beautiful space, that it elevates their mood and their feeling. And
well, there's two funny things we say in architecture about beauty and ugliness. Ugliness is unforgiving. Beauty is timeless. And one of the things about beauty is all of us know what's beautiful and what isn't. We don't maybe know why we think it's beautiful or not, but when we see it, we know it. And it's a funny thing, but you'll drive down the street and you'll look at a house and you'll think to yourself, my goodness, what were those people thinking? And then you'll drive down another street and see a house and go, my goodness, that's a beautiful home. I'd love to live there. And so we all inherently know what beauty is. It's the difference between an architect and a layperson is the architect can tell the person why they don't like something or why they find it beautiful.
oh, that's delightful. Thank you for sharing. Absolutely. If we drive by a particular property and it has symmetry, we're just
Yep,
drawn to it. It calms us. It
yep.
feels right. And then we could drive by a fixer-upper and have another response. So tell me about the life of an architect, if you would, because I can imagine there's an emotional aspect to it where perhaps one moment it's very left brain and another moment it's right brain. What say you?
You're right about that. It's a very interesting way to make a living. It's exciting because I get to design something new every couple of weeks or every couple of months. I'm working on a whole new project. I mean, how many people get to do that in their life? Maybe an actor who works on stage and does a different play or does a different movie. So you get to apply your craft continually on different projects, which is really a thrill. And I think that's why architects tend to practice into late life. The other reason we tend to practice into late life is because the first 30 years of our practice experience is usually making mistakes. You don't actually get pretty good at this until you've been practicing for about 30 years. The ones that can do it right out of school, they're genius. I mean, those are the Frank Lloyd Wrights or the Michelangelos. These are the general sort of architectural hardworking sort of guy like me that just plods away. But the results are always the same excitement. Every time I get a new client, I'm creating their dream, which is, wonderful. It's their dream, not mine. So it's important that everything they tell me gets built into the house. The sad part about it is usually their dream has a dollar number attached to it, which is somewhat higher than their reality. So we always have to keep the budgets in mind. And that's the other side of the brain that we have to work with as well. Find a way to balance the two so that the dream doesn't get destroyed and it comes out pretty close to what they're hoping for. Because, what you're really creating, and I guess I've been very lucky from a legacy point of view, is that I'm now working on homes, custom homes, for the grandchildren of some of my original clients. So from a legacy point of view, they've lived in my houses on a number of occasions, or as a young child or as a young grandchild growing up. They have lived in that parent's house or that grandparent's house. And so they're very comfortable with what I do. And so it's kind of a continuation. So that kind of legacy is really important to me. There's probably nothing more exciting than having a client say to you when they drive home and drive up to their house and they walk in and they say, you know what, I just love this place. I am in my castle. This is the place where I feel protected It's the place where I'm comfortable. It's where I enjoy life. And when you can get a client into that position in a house, it's the biggest reward an architect can have.
That's lovely. And I know you've used the word romantic at times in describing the hat an architect can wear at times.
Yeah, there's a certain form of house, and a house being a home is important that house does two things. One, it needs to address the site or the neighborhood that it's in. It has to have what we refer to as architectural good manners. And you've probably seen lots of projects that don't have that. And it also has to represent the romance of the area, especially some of the places I have to put new houses. They are, beautiful areas of cities. If you take Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, for instance, there's wonderful areas in Pittsburgh, and to go in and do something jarring would be the worst thing you could do. You would ruin the romance, not only of the house you're designing, but you would ruin the romance of the entire neighborhood. And so architects carry a huge responsibility, because what you do may stand for 100, 150, 200 years. Hopefully. And that means you also have to build those houses, when we talk about romance, with materials that people are romantically involved with: stone, slates, all those kind of traditional materials that show the history of the area and where the future could go. And so you need to take all of those elements of poetry, romance, and dollars into account to make it happen. It's quite a balancing act.
I can imagine. And I've also heard about clinker bricks. Clinker bricks can
Oh,
add
yeah.
to the character.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, clinker's interesting because as we started manufacturing bricks in factories, the kilns sometimes overheated, and the bricks that were closest to the flames got burnt on the ends. And architects, always being innovative generally, they looked at that and said, well, why don't we, instead of throwing those bricks out, why don't we use them as headers in amongst the brick pattern to create a different feel for the whole house? So clinker bricks became a typical romantic kind of element, both in New York City and Pennsylvania and Philadelphia, and also up in Canada, in Toronto and some of the areas here as well, Montreal. So.
Yes, and you have referred to yourself sometimes as an innovator or even a maverick. So I was curious, what do you think you did right over the years?
I think probably the biggest thing we did right was listen to clients, and we'll go into that a little bit, because I think to give you an example, we had a piece of land, and this is when I was doing development work as well as our different than architecture directly. And we had a piece of land that we were trying to put some townhouses on, and there was only room for about 11 little townhouses. And we noticed, and we talked to some professional female women that were school teachers, nurses, junior bankers, and this goes back into the era of the early 80s. And we found out that these ladies, as talented and as secure as they were not able to get mortgages that they could sign for themselves. And consequently, a lot of these people, these wonderful, talented, accomplished women, couldn't buy a house. So they were renting apartments, and they'd rent a one-bedroom apartment, and they were paying at the time, let's say $350 a month. So we decided we would create 11 apartments, but in the form of townhouses, that these ladies could buy, and we would carry the mortgage for them if they needed. And the mortgage would end up carrying for the same price as a rental unit, because we did it without doing it as a condominium, so that they didn't have the continued cost, the condominium corporation or a co-op corporation. And so this was during a recession in the early 80s, and we thought, well, this will never sell. And I get a call as I went away to Florida to look at another project, and I got a call from the real estate agent and said, do you have any more land? And I said, what are you talking about? He said, the project sold out last night in 15 hours completely. So we hit the market correctly. And I think that's the kind of thing we almost always did was listen to the people that we thought would be buying our product. And that makes a big difference, whether you're designing it or whether you're developing it. Understanding what the market, where the hole is in the market that you have to fill. So I think that's what we did best.
Yeah, sound advice. I know that there are a number of young individuals that listen and tune into this podcast, and one of the questions that always comes up is success tips and what worked and so forth. So with al fresco living or lifestyle, the indoor-outdoor flow being very popular today, I wondered, what is it that you're looking forward to? Is it, capturing more of clients' identities, a sense of community?
I think both. One of the problems we have with this relationship to outdoors and indoors, and I blame California for this, by the way. My clients will come on to our first meeting and they say, well, I just love this house I saw in California. It had this whole wall of glass that opened up to the Pacific Ocean. And I'd like to have that in Northern Ontario looking at one of the lakes. And to do that in 80-degree weather, compared to doing it in 30-degree weather is a whole different world. And so
Hollywood did it. Why can't Toronto?
That's right. Why can't Toronto? And so, the snow flying in and trying to keep the doors from freezing up and all that kind of stuff. So it's that kind of thing is always a difficult sort of connection. However, one of the things that we love to do, and this goes back to when we talked about landscaping originally, how important it is. We like to bring on early in our design projects some great landscape architects. And I've had the pleasure of working some fabulous people. And the landscape architect usually, and I don't mean gardeners. Gardeners look after landscape. Landscape architects design it. And the landscape architects we've worked with are wonderful because they take into account the fact that the outdoor space is really outdoor rooms, right? And that's an important factor, very important. And their knowledge of how a room should work, much like an architect's knowledge, is super important to making the house fit the site. There's an old adage I've said, every time I win a award for a house, sometimes I look at it afterwards in the photographs and I say, I'm not sure my house won this award. I think the landscaper won the award. Because the house works so well with the site that's where the real success is. And architects will tell you a great house on a poorly designed site. In other words, if the house doesn't fit the site, it'll never be a great house. You can do a mediocre house on a fabulous site, and if it connects with the site, it'll always be a wonderful house. And so landscape is that important to the design of a house. It's huge.
Yes, and I can imagine that as our society becomes more and more technically involved with the iPhone and Zoom, and we're going to almost crave a balance when it comes to seeking out nature and wanting to sit underneath the oaks and so forth.
Yes, well, one of the landscape architects we work with, who works both internationally and around the world, the United States has an office in the US and in Canada. And she's an amazing woman. She has started designing years ago healing gardens. And she started designing those for people in hospitals that had problems, that trying to get through things. And the healing gardens really changed their lives.
Because they're in their valley in their life. Yes.
Absolutely. And so, that's the kind of input we get from some of the landscape architects we work with. It's amazing. Yeah.
Yes. Is there anything that you wish you would have designed? And then we're going to get to the legacy bit.
Yeah. Amazingly enough, I've designed so many different types of, products. But where my real love is single family custom residential. And perhaps what I haven't designed that I would like to design might be let's say a private club. I've never had a chance to design a private men's club, a private women's club, or a golf club, or a golf sort of complex. Never had the chance to do that. I've done plenty of estates, with lots of outbuildings and dependencies, but never have done one of the major clubs. So that I would like to take on before I retire.
Yes, well, I think that that is a brilliant idea, and hopefully that there might be a listener out there who could tune in and reach out to you. And because I know a lot of the time some of those golf clubs are very traditional and they have not been updated
Right.
in a number of years, let alone decades. So since this is a legacy podcast, I found it very, in terms of synchronicity, that you've also thought about legacy, given what I read on your website. So how do you look at this word? What does this word personally mean to you?
Well, I think legacy is a larger scope. It's not only what you leave for your family or for your friends, but what you leave the world. And that what you're leaving is what you've given to your clients. And hopefully what you've given them, they'll look at as part of their legacy, so that houses aren't torn down as quickly as we think they might be, to be replaced by something that's the flavor of the day. And so that those legacy homes, if they're done properly, go on to create legacy neighborhoods. And those neighborhoods we come back to visit time and time again. So that, from my point of view, is one of the biggest elements of legacy. The other area that personally, as a company, during COVID, I designed, I think, 9 or 10 houses that I designed for the sort of building industry, for the general contractor who needs to build 2 houses or 3 houses at a point, but they don't have the clientele that can pay architectural fees of someone who's in the bracket of doing much bigger homes. So the chance that they ever get a custom designed house is slim or nil because of their tax bracket or their cost bracket. So what we designed was 9 sort of custom homes, taking all the things we learned from our custom work and incorporating them into smaller houses. I think that the largest house was 3,500 square feet, which is pretty small for us. And those are available online through our company called Lipstick, that builders can buy those and build those houses. So it's a way to get what we've learned over 50 years of practice into the general public and help builders do better design. That's what that's all about. So I'm excited about that. I think there's a book probably sitting up behind me here. The other thing we opened was a thing called Lipstick and Architectural Facelift.
Yeah, I just wanted you to just provide a little bit of context, because you kind of threw lipstick in, and for the listener or the viewer, they might not know that it's that you're providing these plans to help their design become more economical and within reach.
That's right, exactly. And lipstick's even more of that market. We started looking into what's available in terms of the existing housing stock in North America. And what we found was the largest housing stocks we have, the real boom sort of came in the 60s and 70s, late 50s after the war. And what we found is there is a huge inventory of story and a halves, side splits, back splits all over North America, in almost every state, every province. And those houses are all due for what my mother used to refer to as put some lipstick on the old gal and send her back out. And
I wondered if that was it, or if it was lipstick on a pig, or what the metaphor was.
Well, my mother, when I told her, she lived to 100 and had all her faculties right up to the end. And I said to her, well, one of the companies we're starting from a legacy point of view is this company called Lipstick and Architectural Facelift. My mother thought for a second, and then she said, yeah, I can see that. Just put a little lipstick on the girl and bring her back out. And that's exactly what lipstick was all about. And I think even our logo has a lipstick sort of kiss on it. And the whole idea of that is to take that huge inventory of houses and make it accessible online for people to take a look and say, you know what, if I wanted this house to have a different feel, what about if I did this, this, and this? And so it has that kind of thing to it on the website. So that's another piece of legacy. And then I think there's two other areas, and I think we won a national award for a historical castle that we took back in the early 70s. And we understand it was the first in North America to take a castle of this sort and turn it into condominiums. And it was 6 condominiums. It was not a big project, but the amount of effort to do it, as you can imagine, on a registered historical property was not an easy thing to do. And it won a Governor's General Award for that. And so I think that will be a legacy that started a lot of balls rolling for saving older buildings and finding new use for them, even though they might be completely historical. And it was always funny because, you know, it used to cost $20 to put a dryer vent through a wall in a regular house. It was about $6,000 to do it through a 3-foot wide stone wall. So, you know, we had to really adjust our budgets in those days.
And I just wanted, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to add that, you know, when I've looked around Los Angeles County, many of the neighborhoods are beginning to get upgraded. But for a while, I felt like in the last decade or two, it's like driving through streets and the houses were, it was like almost like going back in a time period of feeling like I was in the 1950s or 60s because the modernizations weren't happening or the upgrades and so forth.
Yeah, and that has it usually has something to do with availability of money for budgeting. And you know, money, when you think back to the 50s and 60s, now you can't think that far back, but I was born in the 40s, so it'll give you an idea. Like, we didn't have credit right up until probably the late 60s, early 70s before you got credit. Up until those days, you know, you took out a pay now or get the thing now and pay for the furniture over 6 months, you know, layaway plans. That was the extent of credit. And, you know, mortgages were tough to come by. So it wasn't until the financial industry started to bring in tools that people could afford to get money to change these things. So anyway, that will happen. The other things in legacy that are important to me were a major high rise we did, which in Canada back again in the 80s was the first high rise that we're aware of, at least in this country, where we did all 3 elements of the neighborhood. In other words, the ground floor retail, second floor office, and then 12 stories of condominiums above that. And we had a difficult time trying to get the landscape requirement. You know, there's always this connection of how much landscape and how much sort of building can you have. And because the building was a downtown site, it required that we turn all of the roofs in the entire building as it stepped back into green roofs. And so we did green roofs back in the 80s. And that was basically set a first for doing stepped housing with green roofs. And it's still today one of the, you know, the city that it's in, they still use the photograph, an aerial photograph of that building to show how green space can actually be done. So we were a little bit ahead of our time on that one, and I'm excited about that as a legacy. And the last one that I think part of that legacy was those little freehold townhouses we did for professional women that I told you about. That started an interesting thing that would happen today, or in those days. Say a 1-bedroom apartment would be, say, 900 square feet or so, somewhere around that size. Well, the development industry started coming to me and saying, well, how could you sell one of these little townhouses that there's only 600 square feet? How can you sell that? And at the time, it was selling for like $300 a square foot, which was outrageous. How can you possibly do that? And we showed them how we did it with an open plan and all that kind of stuff. And all of those big major developers in Toronto and Ottawa and Montreal then started to switch their designs from 900 square foot 1-bedrooms down to 500 and 600 square foot bedrooms. And that allowed them to get higher coverage on their lots and allowed people to access the housing market at a lower price. And that helped a lot of people get into the housing market. And, it's important to get in when you're young if you can, because you can build a lot of equity through real estate. So that's another area that we were sort of the leader on, and we didn't intend to do that. It's just one of those things that it was a byproduct of what we designed. So these are some of the things I think from a legacy point of view that will go on. Hopefully, maybe my name will be attached, maybe it won't, that's okay. Long as it creates its own legacy.
Yeah, but it sits well in your soul.
It does sit well in my soul. Yeah, I'm proud of it.
Yes.
Very proud of those things. Yeah.
Before we wrap, would you share some of the values, whether it was core values, aspirational values, that you think that your legacy honors?
I think one is tradition. I'm a traditional kind of guy. You'll notice I'm in a suit and tie. I wear a suit and tie to work every day, even when I'm working at home from Zoom. During the pandemic, it doesn't matter to me. So I think that will go on. The tradition shall go on from an architectural perspective. I think the other thing from a legacy point of view is the melting of classical architecture, which is an important item because we don't know where to go if we don't know where we've been, and contemporary architecture. They have to come together. Like the way we live isn't the way we lived in, the early 19th century. So, but the buildings had the most beautiful elements to them that were classical. And I'm classically trained, and I'm still a classical architect. And I still believe that's the best way to design homes, and is to continue to have that tradition. So from that point of view, it's important. And as I'm starting to reach the autumn of my years, I'm doing far more mentoring to younger architects now. And it's exciting to see them, and I call them young, they're in their 40s and 50s, see them approaching the same thinking as I had, but at a much younger age, with regards to the importance of the classical elements of architecture, and starting to understand things such as symmetry. You mentioned it earlier, how comforting symmetry is to most human beings. Like, we look at symmetry and we understand it. It's simple.
Yes.
We know it's in our mind forever. We have two eyes, we have two arms, we have two legs. They're symmetrical on the side of a body. So when we look at a building and it looks like us, so we recognize it, we're comfortable with it. And symmetry and the understanding of symmetry is what makes great architecture. Whether you do it symmetrically or asymmetrically, you still have to pay attention to symmetry within asymmetrical design. And that's a whole lecture that I'd have to give you on that, but you can understand how important those elements are. So tradition, I think, is the biggest thing to carry forward, whether it's as a mentor to other architects or in the work that we've done over the last 50 years. I think I've designed over 1,000 houses in 50 years. So it's a lot of houses. I think Frank Lloyd Wright, no, I can't compare myself to his talent, but.
So you mentioned tradition as well as mentoring. What else is there?
I think permanence. I think the word permanence comes into play for a traditional architect that's doing a house. The biggest excitement is to know that there's what you've built will last. And that means you're going to have to work with really good, strong materials. And those materials, people think, well, if we're still building with stone and wood, then it's not environmentally correct. Actually, it is. If you're building with the indigenous materials of the area you're living in or working in, then the woods that you use, for instance, in the South of the United States, in the Carolinas, we use southern pine for structure. In Arizona, we use, lodgepole pines to build the vegas. In Canada, we use redwoods, and try not to cut them down from California, mind you, but big Douglas fir, things like that. So they are renewables. Stone is renewable. The Greeks and the Italians have always been taking their temples apart. They took apart all the Roman temples, the majority of them, through to Italy, and rebuilt all kinds of things from the original pieces of marble, original pieces of stone. The Egyptians did it with the pyramids. They took the marbles off of them or the limestones off of them and reused those in other constructions. So there's an environmental aspect to building with permanence. And one, the building lasts longer, so you're not redoing stuff. And two, most of the materials can be reused. A good example, we've done houses here in Canada where we've brought in old slate roofs that have been salvaged from projects in France. So those slates will go on forever. And if there's enough of them, you can rebuild the roof with them on a smaller house here. So it's a little expensive to get them here. But once you've done that, the overall cost varies out over if you're talking about a building that'll last 300-400 years, that cost can measure out pretty well in terms of its average.
Yes, yes, absolutely. It's you're talking about the building materials that last and
Right.
are quality. So what I'm hearing is values around tradition, mentoring, permanence. If you could state your legacy concisely in one sentence, would you say that it's making sure that you're bringing beauty into neighborhoods and communities, or what words might you give your legacy if you had to
I
distill
think,
it to one sentence?
yeah, I think that's a touch arrogant to think that I'm bringing the beauty. The really great, beautiful neighborhoods are already beautiful. My job is to not mess them up. That's my job. And that's just as important as the original architects that brought beauty to those places. The Harry Lindberghs, the McKim, Mead and Whites. These were great architectural firms that brought beauty to the world. And Frank Lloyd Wright. So my job is not to bring something that's ugly. My job is to bring something that enhances that beauty, or at least doesn't make it an eyesore. And that's, the arrogance of architecture. You have to be very careful. Architects, everything on this earth, man has made other than what God has made. So it becomes, architects get this idea in their head sometimes that they are star architects, that what we do is more important than anything else. And that's not true. What's more important is what, great classical architecture has brought to the world. And they've brought us that through what God created. We could go into a long lecture of the importance of the sacred geometry of architecture, things such as the golden proportion, 1 to 1.681 and also, the Vesica Pisces, which is the shape of the fish. And you'll see that in Christianity and in other religions. And that creates the pointed arch in the Gothic cathedral. Those kind of things that come from nature, we'll call it, and are represented in the architecture that was built in classical times. And through those years, they created wonderful senses of beauty. And that's why when you look at things such as the Vesica Pisces, that's where two circles intersect, the space in between. It's the shape of the human eye. And that shape is recognizable immediately by a human because we look at each other's eyes, right? And that shape, if you'll notice, so many companies use it as their logo. Now that you know that, you'll look for the logos, whether it's, and I shouldn't mention names, but you'll know them the minute you see them. And there's lots of them. Car companies, phone companies, all kinds of them use the Vesica Pisces because it is part of that sacred geometry that has built the world. And so our job is not to mess it up.
Yes, yes. Okay. So incorporating in the natural world and honoring it, building upon it.
Yeah, very much. Yeah. Very much.
What else? And is there anything else? Just to round out our conversation today.
Yeah, I think those are the important things. And the mentoring, I go back to the mentoring. It's so important. I didn't have the chance to be mentored directly by some great architects. What I did have the ability to do was access their work so that it influenced me, because everything has been designed. Any great architect will tell you almost everything has been designed once. And what most of us do is we take the influence of history and we rework it to suit everyday problems that we have. And that's the important aspect to it all. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to share that I appreciate that you are valuing knowledge and that knowledge needs to be passed down and shared in order to lift up all of the community and to understand where our origins come from. I think you shared a line earlier in our conversation as I draw this episode to a close, but you had shared something paraphrased. If you don't know where you don't know where you're going if you don't know where you've been. So I appreciate that your gratitude towards our heritage and understanding just the origins of it all and where it comes from and the roots. And so, yes, so thank you very much. And I'm just going to close this out. And if you don't have anything else, I'll move to my closing paragraph.
Perfect. Go ahead.
Okay. And thank you also again for your generosity and again, speaking into what it is that you know, because again, if we haven't sat in the architectural classrooms that you have, there's a lot that we can just not know in being able to make those connections.
My pleasure.
So in closing, I'm Angelina Carlton, the hostess to the Design Your Legacy podcast, as well as the founder to Legacy Planning, a boutique coaching and advisory firm based out of Beverly Hills, California, USA, but international in those I coach. I hope to dive deep into subjects that can help a person define, develop, and execute their legacy and continue to scour the landscape for those who can be great resources to every dimension of your legacy. For many listeners, there can never be enough education and preparation in the moat around your castle. Whether you find yourself with new wealth or generational wealth, may the content on this channel be an anchor in any storms ahead. We do our best to provide original content for your intellectual and emotional curiosity. Thank you for joining us today. And if you're listening on YouTube, please remember to subscribe and like, or if it's on Apple Podcasts, to rate and review. So thank you so much for joining in this week. And thank you, Mr. Williams, for being an excellent guest speaker.
Thank you.